let's talk about translations. I want to talk about practically. So we did a whole series on Bible translation and
Yeah.
theories and all that stuff. I want to talk practically about what do you think has happened even in the past 50 years? So what something that I think is helpful
Mm,
for your discussion is the history of specifically English.
yeah.
We are at a very unique point in history where we have so many English translations, and it's unique because we have never had so many translations of one book into one language. I think it's probably safe to say that there are more English translations of the Bible than of any other book into any other single language.
Probably right.
And so I'm asking really a practical question here. What are the advantages and disadvantages to this? I know for my own well, let me just leave you with the question. I won't give you my own my own
Don't tip
opinions
your
on
hand here, Kevin. Come
it.
on.
Sorry.
Well, okay,
Let me
okay. So first, let me qualify. Was that your question? Is like,
yeah,
why
yeah.
do we have so many? Okay. First qualification. I actually think it is unique in that we have so many. Yes, but it is not unique in that we have multiple to choose from. And this is actually a point I often make when I talk about the history of English, because a lot of people think some of this is just this flattery that we tend to always think we live in a moment that's totally unique, and nobody's ever had to deal with our problems. But actually, when the King James comes around, you have a dozen English translations on the market at that point. People often don't realize that one of the reasons for the King James Bible's success is that the king basically gives it a stamp of approval and bans the sale of other translations. Well, that tends to help your book sales if people can't buy your competitors. But you've got the Geneva Bible. The King James itself is a revision of the Bishop's Bible from 1602. You've got a translation by a guy named Richard Taverner. You've got Tyndale still. Let's see. You've got Coverdale's. Okay. What am I missing? You by that time you got the Dewey Rhymes, which is the Catholic translation of the Vulgate. Okay. So you've got right there. That's just six. All right. Now I'm not saying you go to any bookshop and it's like it is today, where you've got a whole wall of them. I'm not saying that everybody has equal access to all of those. At a certain point, some of them stop getting published and they're not as accessible and all that. But we are not the first people in history to have to think about which English translation is the best, right?
Right.
People have had to think about that. And really what I would argue is that the time of history, roughly 250 years, where the King James Bible is the English Bible, that's actually the historical anomaly. Okay. And even if you go back in time, if you think about something like the Septuagint, okay, the Greek translation of the Old Testament has revisers. Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion also revise that. And so when Origen comes along in the 2nd century, he produces this hexapla, this six-fold, six-column Bible, precisely to show the differences between them. So one of the points John Mead, my co-author of the book, we often make about translation is there's very little new under the sun. There aren't many problems that we have to deal with that nobody's ever had to deal with before when it comes to translation. That doesn't make them unimportant, but it just should relieve some of the tension we feel about it, where
So
it's
I
not
think
new.
just to push back on you a little bit on
Sure.
this, I think part of the tension is not that there are multiple English translations, but the access to the translations.
Yes,
So the
that's fair.
fact that I can pull up this passage, the cry of dereliction,
Yep,
in 20 different translations
yep,
in 2 seconds and then look at all of them, right? I think
yep.
for the everyday person, and this would be a quick, and I don't know if you know anything about this, how many people owned multiple versions would be one
Yeah, that's
question.
a good question.
You know,
That's a
it's
good
like
question. Yeah,
I get that,
yeah,
w- and I
sure.
think it's a helpful point, right, that you're
Yeah, that's
making
fair.
that for sure people have in the past dealt with this issue, but to me
Mm.
it seems like it's been an issue for scholars, right, to say, okay, which one is better,
Yeah,
right? But for a layperson,
yes, that's
unless
true.
they're looking at multiple versions, they're not going to even. I mean, maybe they know
Yeah,
that there are versions out there that
yeah,
are different, and this is kind of my concern. And the heart behind the question is,
yeah,
if you pull up all these different versions, how in the world do you know which one is right?
yeah,
It's like
right,
if you don't
right,
know Greek,
right. Okay, okay, it's a great question, and it's a fair question, 'cause I do not know how many people, say, in the early 17th century have multiple translations on their shelf. Probably not most people. Okay,
right?
but here's where I'll push back just a little on your pushback.
Sure.
I actually think most English Bible readers today don't care as much as we think they do. You
Mm,
and I do, and the
right.
people who email us do. So we naturally tend to think everybody out there is really worried about this question. And it's easy for me because everywhere I speak on this topic all the time, and it's the number one question I get: which translation is the best, right?
Right. Right. Right.
So it's easy for me to think that's what people are worried about all the time. My wife never thinks about it. She just
Yeah.
reads her ESV. Does she know there's other translations? Of course, she's married to me, right? I mean, she can't not. But like, she doesn't worry about it. My mom has read the King James Bible most of her life. At one point, I switched her over to the Net Bible. So I was like, Mom, this is the translation my seminary professors made. You got to read it. She read it for like, I don't know, 3 or 4 years. And then she's like, nah. And she went back to her King James, right? Does she know there are translations? Of course. But is she a Bible teacher? No. So she doesn't care. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like, she care when she has to. If the past, if the preacher points it out or something, but she's just like an ordinary Christian. So I don't think most ordinary Christians actually care as much as some of us think. Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
that's not to say that people don't care and not to say they shouldn't care. So let's keep a couple things in mind. One, I think let's ask the question, why are there multiple translations? And there's any number of reasons to this. I give about 5 in the book, but I'll just point out one here since we're talking mostly about like that we're kind of thinking about translation philosophy, let's say. There are multiple ways to translate the same Greek text into English, right? You can do it 4 or 5 different ways and still be faithful to the meaning of the Greek, right? So different translators have different translation philosophies. And then with this, and here's why people care, really. If that was all it was, I think most of us would be like, fine. Like, how many of us worry about, like, if you're going to read a Russian novel like Dostoevsky, how many of us are like, I've got to compare translations? No, none of us. Why? Because we don't care that much about Dostoevsky. Now, if we're a teacher and we're a literature professor at college, then yes. Or if we speak Russian and can read Russian, then we might care. But for the bulk of us, we're like, look, the basic story is going to be the same either way.
Well,
It's going to be a big book and it's going to be intense. I just need to be able to read it. You
again, though,
know?
I think this is the unique thing about the Bible. It's like even our
Yes.
numbering system allows us
Yes.
to say, here's a sentence. Let's view it in
Yes.
isolation. And let's view that against every
Yes.
other possible translation
Yes.
of this single sentence, you know?
This is very
Whereas,
true.
and you're right, with other
Different kind of
translated
book.
texts, you don't even think,
You
I
don't
mean,
care.
you're reading through the whole story, right? And I think we should be
Yes.
reading the Bible more like that.
Yeah, for
but
sure.
but the reality is that we are where we are today and people can do that, right? And so
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
it's so much easier to see
Yes.
these
Okay.
kinds
And
of
so
things.
here, and then here's why people care, right? Because as we know, all translation involves interpretation. It always
Right.
has, it always will. And because the Bible is so important to us, as it should be, okay, we care about that interpretation, really,
Right.
is what we're
Right.
what we're interested in, I think. And so that's where we have these heated debates. I've actually got an article coming out of the Text and Canon Institute in a couple months on exactly this question. Is it a blessing or a curse to have so many translations? I'm going to say yes, it's both. Okay, but here's one thing, a point I make in the article that I've found helps people when they think about this question, because what happens is people tend to feel a lot can feel a lot of anxiety about which translation is best. Okay,
Yeah.
some of this is the fault of marketers. Okay,
Mm.
like I just read the marketing for the NRSV updated edition. That's the latest. I think it may be the latest revision there is now at this point. Just came out like last year. Okay. Well, guess what the marketing for it was? It was like, you now have the most accurate, most accessible, with the best scholarship. You right, like all superlatives. Okay.
Yeah,
No translations ever come out and they're like, this translation is a mediocre one. It's pretty readable,
yeah.
right? It's always like the most readable, the perfect combination of accuracy and readability, right? Like, okay, that's it's marketing. And here's the deal. What are marketers sort of, if I can put it this way, leveraging, or the negative way to say it would be preying on? Okay. Not praying, but like
Yeah, yeah.
like an animal. Okay. Like a lion praying. It's the anxiety we feel in trying to make a decision as buyers. Okay. So there's actually a term for this. I might have the book right here. Hold on. Yes. Okay. This is a really interesting book called The Paradox of Choice: Why More is Less. And the paradox of choice is basically this: the more choices you have in something, the more anxiety you tend to feel when you have to pick one. Okay.
Mm.
So we've all felt this. When if I go to the grocery store and my wife tells me to get something, okay, I'm not the normal grocery shopper in my family. So when I do have to go to the grocery store, it's usually an experience for me. Okay. So she tells me to go there and get spaghetti sauce. Great. I intend to go to the store to get spaghetti sauce. This is very easy. Until I get to the aisle, yes. And then there's like 20 yards of spaghetti sauces. And now I'm like, oh, does it need to have garlic? Should it be classic? Which brand should it be? And now I feel all this angst and I've got to text her like, what kind do you want? Right? So what was going to be a simple decision, I just need spaghetti sauce, and it doesn't really matter. Suddenly now I'm looking at like all these details and comparing them, and now I've got to have the best one, right? So he talks about this in the book about how like having choices or like buying a car, right? You need to go get a reliable car, and then you show up on the lot and there's 20 versions of the same model, and now you're like, ooh, does it need to be red or like deep red? You know, and you didn't care before, and it really doesn't matter to get you to work. But now suddenly that very minor difference takes on outsized significance. And so that's what happens, I think, for people when we pick a translation. Suddenly it's not enough to have an accurate Bible. We have to have the most accurate. And we can't just have the most accurate. Now it's got to be the most accurate and the most readable. And then it's got to be the perfect combination of those things. So what I often say to people is, listen, all of your mainstream evangelical English translations are very good. Any of them will serve you really well. Okay. Now, if you're a pastor, you need to think more about it, probably. Okay.
Yeah.
If you're a teacher like me, I need to teach my students how to think about it. If you're ever teaching on the Bible, it's a good thing to compare translations so that when somebody asks you what my Bible says, you have some answer to that. And then when you're doing theology and the difference in interpretation does affect your theology, as it does and must, you have to care. Do you see? But for the normal Bible reader, pick a good one and read it. Okay.
Yeah. And
And
that
be happy.
that's
Be
the
content.
key. Read it, right?
Read
That's the
it.
key. Yeah,
Read it.
don't argue about, all the different
Yeah.
translations and stuff. Especially I think part of the thing too is if you don't know the original languages,
Hmm.
it's
You've got
not
nothing to go
really
on.
it's not really your place.
That's it.
I mean,
Right.
and
That's right.
again, this is coming from someone who has devoted a good portion of my life
Yeah.
to just like analyzing grammar and trying to figure out what
Yep.
things mean. It's a
Yep.
hard thing. It's a
It's a
hard
hard thing.
task for translators to
Yep.
put the Bible into English. But if you don't know the language really, really well, you really don't have any business like
Yeah.
comparing in
Yeah.
the sense of like this one's right and this one's wrong.
Yeah.
And what I tell people too is like it's helpful. Like
Yeah.
read if you're studying a passage, yeah, read multiple translations with different translation philosophies, not just the ESV and the
Yep.
NASB. It's
Yep.
like you're gonna
Yeah.
get the same thing.
No, that's exactly right. Do the
Um,
NLT and the ESV
yeah,
together. That's a
yeah.
great
I
combo.
I tell people NIV, NLT, ESV. Those are
Hmm.
the just
Yep.
look at them all
Great
together.
combo.
Anyway, so yeah, I think that's really helpful for people, and we will definitely put a link to that article whenever it comes out. We'll add it
The other
to
thing
the
I always
show
try to
notes.
say with this, Kevin, too, is just like to add on, and it's one of his things in the book actually, and I talk about in the article is like one of the ways to get past this paradox of choice, the anxiety, is to cultivate gratitude.
Mm,
And so when I talk on translation, this is always one of my biggest points, and usually my final point is to say, listen, it's fine to argue about translations. I'm not opposed to that. Okay. But our overwhelming sort of attitude about having multiple translations today should be gratitude.
yeah,
Right. Now, I'm not saying all translations are good. There are quack translations. Okay. You may know Mark Ward. I asked Mark to write 2 articles for us at the Texan Canon on what makes a bad Bible translation because I was worried that people were hearing me say there's no such thing as a bad translation. And I'm like,
hmm
no, there are some. They're not the ones I spend a lot of time with, obviously. But this like Passion translation is wonky, right? No, it's nonsense, basically. Okay. Avoid it. But your mainstream ones, the ones we just mentioned, they're all really good.
yeah,
The translators have worked hard. They're building on a long heritage of English Bible translation, right? Like some of the words we have in English to translate terms, we only have because of the Bible, right? Words like scapegoat, Tyndale invents. There's no word scapegoat in English before William Tyndale, right? He invents the word ungodly. Okay. That's like second nature. How can you have a translation that doesn't use the word ungodly? you know,
you can't today.
you can't today, but translation into English is possible partly because there's such a long heritage for it to
Yeah,
draw on. So
yeah, yeah. That's
all
great
things to be grateful for.
for sure.